When I was in youth group, the rest of the church was dubbed Big Church, as I'm sure it is in many places. The youth sat together, they did their own events, and then one day you graduated and were expected to go be a real adult. However, many of my fellow youth group members had a hard time transitioning. Some walked away and some just hung around the youth group still, all the way through the college years and sometimes beyond. We know the statistics these days when it comes to young people leaving the church. They aren't always that great, and sometimes we see this reflected in those numbers that occur right after high school, right after people get out of the youth group. And I think there's got to be a better way to combat all of this and to create things in place that are going to help us out a little bit more. And that's why I brought on today's guest, Luke Dockery. Luke is the Youth and Family Minister at the Cloverdale Church of Christ and an Adjunct Professor of Youth Ministry at Harding University. He's written, I think, like 5 books, most notably for today, the book Youth in Family Ministry, a handbook. I wanted Luke on the podcast today because though we talk about smashing idols and pursuing Christ-like virtues, my big mission is to inspire the church to become so captivating and compelling that people don't want to leave and more people are attracted to us living out this mission. Our culture runs on values contrary to Christ. We're surrounded by a million voices competing for our attention. Even in our own churches, sometimes our eyes aren't firmly on Jesus. So one question remains: who or what do you truly worship? Welcome to the Smashing Idols podcast. I'm Jake Doberenz, and this is your call to break free from the things that pull you away from Jesus Christ. Each week I chat with theologians, ministers, cultural thinkers, and everyday believers to uncover how modern idols sneak into our lives and how we can smash them to pieces. We're not here for surface-level faith. We're here to dig deep, challenge the norms, rediscover what it means to follow Jesus with everything we've got. So if you're ready to kick distractions to the curb and embrace a faith worth living, you've come to the right place. And hey, don't forget to check out jakedoberenz.com/podcast to catch every episode and subscribe to the newsletter. So, you ready? Let's start smashing those idols. Luke, it is good to have you on the show today. Thanks for coming on Smashing
Jake.
Idols.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. Glad to talk with you about youth ministry today.
Well, yeah, the criteria to get on the Smashing Idols podcast is to be interesting and thoughtful, and that's what you are, whether you claim that or not. So,
hey,
yeah.
I'll try not to let you down if you consider me to be that way. We'll see what I can do today.
Well, it's okay. It's okay. I mean, you deal with young people, so I don't know. You've probably mastered the art of maybe being a little bit of cringy. It's just what happens, but
That's true. Yeah.
I'm sure a couple of them like you still, so I'm sure everybody will like you today. That's what I was trying to say. Okay. Yeah, no, fun. Well, I want to just dive in. We got some cool stuff to go through. It's an interesting topic today that I care a lot about because I just want to see the church kind of do church better and live out our mission better. So I'm really excited today. And I think it's very appropriate to begin our conversation with this question. Why do you want to hang out with teenagers as a job? What brought you into this profession? Why this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do enjoy teenagers. I find them to be pretty refreshing. They haven't had as much time in their lives to kind of build walls around their emotions and things like that. They tend to value authenticity and they tend to be pretty authentic, or at least they value that and try to be. But having said that, I mean, I certainly have my preferences. Like I work better, I would say, with like high school students, like middle school, junior high. I get to teach a little bit of college, and really it's like that junior, senior year of high school. And then like right after that is kind of, I think, my sweet spot. And so when they get really interesting, they leave me and they go off to college. Right. And so that's, but I appreciate younger students as well. As far as the question of what brought me into this profession, we could probably have an entire podcast episode on that. I won't do that. I'll just give the shorter version. But I grew up as a preacher's kid. My dad was a preacher, and I love my dad. I was raised in a good home, but just kind of like the stresses that I witnessed my dad have in relation to ministry convinced me that I wanted no part of that. So like I was determined I was not going to be a minister, certainly not a preacher, but I wasn't thinking of ministry in any way. I did go to Harding University, which was a Christian school, but I was not a Bible major. I studied international business and Spanish, and I didn't know what I wanted to do with that. I just knew I wasn't going to go into ministry. But actually, the summer after my freshman year, I needed a summer job, and I was approached about doing a summer youth internship. And, just kind of reflecting on what that looked like. I mean, I enjoyed being in youth group. I enjoyed being around teens and things like that. And I was like, yeah, I guess I could do that, but with just no thought to that turning into anything long-term. But I joke now with like college students that I work with that like summer youth internships are like the gateway drug to youth ministry. And that first summer actually wasn't even an amazing experience for various reasons. But what ended up happening, and in hindsight, I can see a lot more clearly that God was doing things in my life to set me on a trajectory. But I ended up just working, doing summer youth internships for several summers in a row. And then after college, I was invited by my church to stay on, the church that I had been working at. And they actually ultimately created a full-time youth ministry position for me. Prior to that, like they didn't have one. So I mentioned these internships. I wasn't working under a youth minister. I was just the guy for the summer. And they ended up creating a full-time position for me. And so that's kind of how that started. And then even then, like I wasn't sure like how long do I want to do this, but I became increasingly convinced that maybe this is what God wanted me to do, some form of ministry, and specifically youth ministry right now. But because I wasn't a Bible major, I felt that I needed additional training. Just by virtue of being at Harding, I had like eight semesters of college level Bible, and I grew up as a preacher's kid. So in one sense, my knowledge was pretty good, but I really hadn't studied ministry or anything like that. And so I ended up going back to school. Took a long time, but I got a MDiv, Master of Divinity, from Harding School of Theology. And part of that, I was hoping that I was going to eventually become a college professor. I would teach Bible and ministry at the collegiate level. And getting an MDiv was kind of a necessary stepping stone to that, while also helping equip me for ministry. But what happened was, in the process of that program, I just fell in love with congregational ministry. And so now here I am. I was trying to do the math. I think I'm going on year 19 as a youth minister, 13-ish at one church, and then I'm in year 6 at my second congregation here. And I do get to teach a little bit on the side, and that's plenty. Like I don't desire now to be a full-time professor. I like just kind of dipping my toes in those waters, but youth ministry has really become a calling and a vocation, though it was not something I identified growing up.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I have some similarities in my journey. I was not a preacher's kid, but I did do one of those summer youth ministry kind of intern things, also at a church that did not have a youth minister. So I was pretending like I knew what I was doing. It was great. It was great. Yeah, and also for a time was seeking the academic route, and maybe that's still in the cards. We'll see. But I really appreciate your heart for congregational ministry, because we need that. And your church stats are pretty impressive. I mean, it's been a hot second since I've heard the stats, but something like ministers last like 3 years at a church or something on average. Right. It's not good. So the fact that you put some significant years under your belt is really awesome to hear, first of all.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm a big believer in longevity in ministry, and And I do think, I mean, for me, as I increasingly kind of discerned God's call to ministry, sometimes people ask me. So I'm 41, and so sometimes people ask me like, "How long are you going to do this?" And increasingly, it's like, well, until God calls me to do something else. As long as I feel like this, I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. I'll try to keep doing it, even if it gets a little bit harder for me to play, hours of basketball with high school students than it did, 15 years ago. But that's okay.
For sure, yeah. Well, I grew up under a youth minister that was in his 60s, so hey, you never know,
Yeah,
you never
absolutely.
know. Well, maybe we can kind of get into this title that you have at your current job. You're the youth in family ministry guy. Like, can you explain what that means, and specifically kind of these twin pillars of physical family and faith family, and what's
Yeah.
this whole thing?
Yeah. So, okay. So youth in family minister is my title. And a lot of times people might assume that that's like a typo, because what you normally hear is youth and family ministry. That's kind of the common terminology. And in my own research, that kind of developed in the maybe late 80s, early 90s, youth and family ministry. And that was an effort to say, hey, it's about more than just a youth group. Like these kids belong to families, and we should try to minister to families as well in some sense. And I think that that's a good intention. But I think that words matter, and the way that we use them matter, and kind of set expectations. And so when we say youth and family ministry, I think we convey the idea that youth ministry and family ministry are two ultimately different and unrelated things. And we're trying to somehow bring them closer, but they're still different. And instead, I like to talk about youth in family ministry, because the idea that I'm trying to propose is that we are ministering to young people within the context of family. And that's true both in the context of, or in the sense of, faith family and physical family, which you mentioned. And I kind of call those in my book and in the youth ministry class I teach at Harding, I call those the twin pillars of youth and family ministry. And I think that when we look at Scripture over and over again, we see that God has given two different groups the task of passing on faith to the next generation. The physical family, so parents, grandparents, brothers, sisters. In our context, sometimes that might be adoptive parents, right? Maybe not birth parents, but the people that you live with are given this task of passing faith on to the next generation, but also the faith family. And that's true whether we look in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and we see the people of Israel, or in the New Testament, the church. Collectively, the community of God's people also share in this task of passing faith on to the next generation and helping cultivate the process of spiritual formation. So for me, when I talk about youth in family ministry, I'm talking about, like we want to work with young people and help them develop a mature and lasting faith. But the two primary vehicles that we want to use to help bring that about are the physical family and the faith family. I call them twin pillars, kind of like with the structure. You only have one. I think it's an unsound structure. You really need both. And to be honest, it's quite challenging to do that well, especially because most of our churches are operating with some just kind of assumptions that actually the way to do youth ministry is we should just kind of isolate our teens, give them to like the spiritual guru youth minister person, and just let him take care of these kids, and we'll get them back in 5 or 6 years, and hopefully everything will turn out. Well, we have a lot of data now to suggest that doesn't work. And so what I'm trying to do is to suggest a different way of doing stuff, which in many ways I would say is not a new idea, but a radical return to God's original design. And so I think that's biblical. And I think we also see in research studies that this tends to work as well. And, maybe it shouldn't be shocking to us that when we do things God's way, it has better results than when we try to come up with something on our own.
It should not be that shocking, but sometimes, it is. I appreciate that. I mean, the podcast about smashing idols, and one of the idols sometimes that we fall into, could be whatever, but we get stuck in these routines. This is the way that I grew up doing it, or this is the way it should be because it's been going on since, the 80s or whatever. I don't know. It's like, okay, well, sometimes we do need to let's go back to the original. Let's figure this out. Let's question some of our assumptions and do something better.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think I call it the traditional youth ministry model.
Mm.
I think it can be kind of an idol because, by the way, like students really like that in a lot of ways. Like, hey, you don't have to hang out with these adults. We'll just give you your own space. Depending on your age, it'll be kind of like a Disney World type of experience, or maybe when you get older, kind of like a rock concert vibe, or whatever that looks like. It'll be something that's tailor-made for you that you'll like. You won't have to be bothered by these older people. In the summers, we're going to just, like, if you'll come be with us for all of our stuff, like, you hardly even have to spend time at home. Like, we'll take you away for weeks on end at these different trips doing this stuff all the time. And students kind of like that. And when you start changing and challenging that, it's not always super popular. But like, our idols are often things that we like. They're just things that are ultimately not good for us, which is why they need to be smashed, which, is the point of your podcast. So there we go.
That's right. Thank you. I didn't even pay you to do that. Tied it all back in. Beautiful. That's actually a good segue, though, because, I mean, I've heard this stat for years. In the book Sticky Faith, Dr. Kara Powell and Dr. Chep Clark talk about this 5-to-1 ratio where each kid in church needs 5 adults investing in their lives to kind of ensure this proper faith formation. Like I said, I've heard that for years. I think it's a great goal. I'm a fan of it. But how in the world do we kind of go about doing that? When we're used to the siloing and the segmenting, the segregating, how do we get the younger people to invest in the older people and the older people to invest in the younger people? What does that look like in your experience?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I love Powell and Clark and their work and the Sticky Faith books. Those were really transformative for me. And I think they're fundamentally right. This 5-to-1 ratio, whether that's the exact number or not, like this idea that we need to cultivate a community of adult Christians around our kids who are not like a paid youth minister or your own parents. Hopefully those are a given, but beyond that, I think that's great. And I do think it's challenging in a lot of our churches, maybe for a couple of reasons. One, and I kind of reference this obliquely, but this problem of age segregation that has developed, which is basically the way that it's really a societal problem, but it's one that churches just kind of whole stream imported into church practices. But this idea of how we as a society have systematically isolated young people from the very relationships that help them grow to maturity. And so you go back in time, like, for example, when we were largely a rural agricultural society, like kids grew up on the farm with their parents and they worked alongside them all the time. Fast forward today, it's like a lot of my kids can't even tell you what their parents do for a living, right? They're like, I think they work with computers and do something. I don't know, Well, that's very different than working alongside your parents and learning a skill from them. And also, probably picking up life wisdom and advice and things like that as it goes on. So that's just one example. But so it is a challenge to do this because we have a culture, both inside the church and outside of it, where we largely are not intergenerationally together naturally a lot. It's just not something that happens. You don't naturally have a lot of these relationships that happen. I do think there's an exception to that, and that's you and I think, both grew up in the Fellowship of Churches of Christ, and historically, Churches of Christ have been rural and small. And I do think that in small churches, this tends to naturally happen. Like if you're a kid at a small church, more often, like, the adults at that church know who you are and they know you by name. I grew up at a church that was not huge. It was not small, but it was probably about 160, 170. Now, my dad was a preacher, as I mentioned, and so like everybody knew me. But I grew up at a church where it's like there were a lot of adults who knew about me, who would ask me questions. Maybe some of those were just kind of surface level relationships, but I still knew they knew my name and cared about me. And there were some people who really invested in me heavily. And so some of that happens. The point I'm making is that some of this happens naturally in smaller groups, in smaller churches. Well, what's happened as we become a less rural society, a lot of people move to the cities and the suburbs, and you hear statistics all the time about churches closing their doors, but those are largely small congregations that are closing their doors. And some of that happens because people are leaving those churches to conglomerate with other churches. So over time, like a lot of our churches have actually gotten bigger. And so and that's when it's like, well, man, we got a lot of teens now. We better hire a youth minister. Maybe we should build a separate building over there to stick them in. And so a lot of the culture I think that we're dealing with is in a lot of these larger congregations. And a lot of smaller congregations, I would say a lot of this still happens organically where adults know kids. But in larger congregations, a lot of what we do, I would say, is we try to strategically get smaller. And that happens in a few different ways. And so, like, for example, without going into great detail, at our congregation, at our church, I'm the full-time youth and family minister. My wife works part-time, and she works with children's ministry and children's education. And in our grade school program, grades 1 through 6, our Bible classes, they have this rotational model where basically they rotate through 6 different classrooms every 3 weeks, so Sunday morning and Wednesday night. And they have different teachers in those 6 classrooms, and so they see a lot of different faces. But while they're rotating around, they also have these guides, we call them guides, who guide them from place to place. And at the beginning of every class period, they spend time basically doing spiritual disciplines and spiritual formation. So they talk about life, and they pray together about things that are going on in life, and they'll sing songs, and they'll memorize scripture. They also try to connect outside of those times. So some of our guides will have like yearly Christmas parties or maybe plan activities or things like that. So we're intentionally over time lining up these adults who are in their lives for a season. Sometimes it might be a whole year. Sometimes they might cycle back around and do it again later. We do something similar in our youth group. For us, youth group is grades 7 through 12. And on Wednesday nights during the school year, we have what we call cell groups, where we basically take our whole youth group and we break into smaller groups. So it's like I'll present a lesson, a short lesson. Then we have these discussion groups, which are led by adult Christians of various ages. Right now, I usually have probably about 40-ish teens on a Wednesday night, but we have with those 40 teens about 15 adult Christians of different ages. Some of them are college students, all the way up to in their late 50s or 60s. And so it's very intergenerational, and they do very similar things to what I just described with our guides in grade school. They talk about their lives, they pray together, they have spiritual conversations based on the lesson that we had, and they try to connect, and they'll do stuff outside of those times as well. They'll send them texts on their birthday or when they're taking a big test saying, "Hey, I was praying about you." They'll go watch their games. They'll have events just for their groups and things like that. And so I say all that to say we're trying to build rhythms into the life of our church. So like if you grow up in our church and you participate in things, we're trying to build rhythms where it's like by the time you're gone, there will be several adults who have interacted with you for an extended period of time and have shown that they care for you by showing up over and over and over, both inside the church and also hopefully outside as well, in these different contexts. So that's 2 things. And then a third thing I would say that we do on Sunday nights, we have small groups. Now, this is not a youth ministry thing. This is a congregational thing, and these are intergenerational. It's not just like we have a youth group, small group. People just kind of choose where they want to go. And Jake, when I moved to this church over 5 years ago, I had no experience in small groups before that, and I signed up to lead one. I had no idea what I was doing, and I guess what I'm trying to say is I didn't come here with this on my mind, but this has become like one of the best forms of ministry that I do. It's just being and helping lead a small group and seeing all these different people who we go through life together. And again, our formula is very simple. Like we read the Bible and we talk about it, we sing some, and we pray about things that are going on in our lives. And it's like through this process, it's like we are growing as disciples together, and we're also building relationships. And so it's like I get to know people all sorts of different ages, but also like there are students in our group, and they're not just getting to know me, they're getting to know these other random adults and parents and things like that. So that's kind of like three examples of things that we try to do as a church. So we might say faith family to try to help this occur. And all of them have the common theme of we're trying to go from a large group of 700 people worshiping together to smaller strategic groups where these connections can happen. And then also on the physical family side, we do try to encourage parents. And like just this past semester, we had a class, we actually based on the book Sticky Faith. We talked about some of this research where we explicitly encourage parents, hey, who can you go through life together with? Who are some other families or adults that you can identify who can pour into your kids? And we have some families here who have chosen to do that, who kind of parent together. I mean, almost like parenting cohorts where it's like they're kind of on similar pages. They spend a lot of times together. A lot of times they're in the same small groups and things like that. And so really, it's like we're trying to bring this about through both pillars, both the physical family and the faith family.
Well, I really appreciate you going through all those things. Those are really practical, good examples of how we can do this and how we can accomplish that. And I mean, in my experience, my church was, maybe closer to Church of Christ mega church, I guess, because we had like 400 people, or whatever. But still, a lot of that happened very organically. I was very connected with the various ages at my church. But I credit small groups for a lot of that, whether I liked it or not. My parents dragged us to Sunday night small groups. Sometime when I was a wee child, they nixed the whole Sunday night gather at the church kind of traditional worship thing.
Yeah.
And we got into homes, and I don't know, I joke to people sometimes, like at church, I just collected grandmas, like collecting Pokemon cards or whatever. Like just give me some more grandmas and grandpas and just different people that were praying for me and investing in me, and would definitely notice if you weren't there and would care about that. And that's beautiful. But then I can think of some churches on top of my head where I walk in there and they understand, okay, we're large. We need to do the small group thing. We need to have smaller segments. But then it's fascinating because it's based off of your age demographic or based off of your gender or marital status. Like that's what it always is. You can do the singles, you can do the marrieds, you can do the 30-somethings, the 20-somethings, the men's, the women's. And I don't know. There are advantages to that. Like I said, I have been like a college minister. I've been like an age-based minister, kind of like that. I've done the youth ministry thing too. But I just feel like we're missing out when the only kind of smaller subset group experience is just people just like you.
No, I think you're right. And I try to be clear. Sometimes I give people the impression they're like, so like, did you disband your youth group? What is that? And it's like, no, we have a youth group. I'm a youth minister. It's just, we're trying to be strategic in the way we go about doing this. And so like, we want to be really intergenerational. We talk about intergenerational all the time at my church. And that's partially my fault. Like I'm the intergenerational guy, right? But the reality is that doesn't mean that you're intergenerational in every single setting. And there are times where it makes a lot of sense to have like an age group or an affinity group or whatever, like a ladies' Bible class or a seniors ministry or college ministry or whatever. I mean, goodness, I'm in a college town. Like we like 200 college students every week, right? And so I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But it's like if you're going to do that some and hopefully do it well, you need to balance that with other very specific intergenerational things. And so that's one of the things I love about our small groups. We do some stuff that's age-based, but those are not. And like anyone's welcome to come. Now, they still tend to, like there are some small groups that have lots of college students in them and some that don't have as much. But that's not because we're structuring it that way. That's just what people choose to do. But we try to be strategically and intentionally intergenerational at times to make sure that's a part of who we are, even if we don't always do that.
Yeah, I surveyed a bunch of college students at my alma mater and some in my college ministry back when I did that a couple of years ago. And I was surprised to find that a lot of, these are college age kids, 18 to 26 or whatever. A majority of them, something like 60% of them said, yeah, I want older people to speak wisdom into my life. And I don't know. We have so many stereotypes about kids. They'll just think I'm some boomer and out of touch with whatever, cringy, this or that. I don't know.
Yeah.
But no, a lot of these kids said, no, I actually want them to advise me. And as we dug deep into that, there's still an element of trust that needs to be built. They can't just
Right.
say, hey, here's how you should live your life, because young people specifically will be like, what are you doing? But our young people want this and crave it. Even like we talked about above, like, yeah, it might not be rock concerts and pizza that really packs it in, but at the end of the day, I'm sure you found your younger kids enjoy this kind of thing.
Yeah, no, they do, for sure, and we do, we do fun stuff, whatever.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. Like the research I've seen of teens, and I'm confident that it is true of college students as well, is that they desperately want relationships with adults who know them and care about them, and that's sometimes the sticking point. Like there might be an assumption that like you don't know me, you don't care about me, which is why it's important, I think, that we build rhythms that enable these adults to show up regularly and demonstrate that they do care. Like I try to work with my cell group leaders and tell them like, hey, the goal of cell groups is not for you to correct all of their faulty theology, because they will have some. They're like 14, right? And like occasionally, yes, like, yeah, you might need to do that. But like, that's not the goal. The goal is for you to just connect with them. And as you connect with them, you kind of like earn the right to say hard things to them when they need to hear it. But until you've done the hard work of connecting, it's like you can say what you want, but they're just going to hear it as a lecture and they're going to tune it out. So what we're trying to do is create space for these authentic relationships to grow. And then it's like, yeah, then they're ready to hear the wisdom. They want to hear the wisdom from people that they know and trust. And so you got to put in the time and effort. And you can't do that by just worshiping in the same room together and assume that means something. There's got to be more to it than that.
Yeah, it's not just high-fiving them every Sunday when you see them and saying hello.
Right. That's right. It's like that's a good thing to do, but like that's
right.
not the ultimate goal. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Bare minimum, acknowledge their existence, but we should do a lot more than bare minimum.
That's right.
Yeah. No, I love your word rhythm. I think that's super important there. Build in those rhythms. So this might seem like a weird question to kind of end on before we start to wrap up, but what is the purpose of church? I mean, we've talked a lot about specific ways that you're trying to help with the faith formation of young people. Let's zoom out a little bit. Let's just end with a banger here. Like, why church, and how does that fit in with what it means to be a Christian?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I was actually asked a similar question in the youth ministry class I teach at Harding the other night. A student was asking, like, we go to chapel. Like, what's the difference between that and church? And I was like, well, and like I had to go into all this. Like, sometimes people use the word church to talk about a building. Sometimes we use the word church to talk about like the worship, the corporate worship that occurs in that building. But really, it's like in Scripture, we see the church talked about as an assembly of people, but it's like the family of God. It's the body of Christ. It's all these different images. And like, sure, you can worship in other contexts, but like when you go to chapel, you're not with the church, because that's just a bunch of students, many of whom, like some but many of whom you don't, as opposed to the body of Christ, which is like this covenanted family that is there together to help one another along. Despite the fact that we're in very different places in age and maturity and all sorts of other circumstances and characteristics, but to help one another along in this lifestyle of discipleship. And so it's like, I think the church is important in that regard, because we're all there together helping one another fulfill God's mission. And then that's a really big level, important, like what is God's mission? Well, it's like, Jesus gives us the Great Commission to go into all the world and make disciples of all the nations. And so in some sense, I would say something like this, like the point of the church is to be a community of people who are living as agents of new creation and ministers of reconciliation, who are these bright spots in a dark world, who are not seeking to change the world through, the accumulation of power or political action. If we could just get the right people there, or if we could accumulate enough resources, we could do this. But rather by this very, what to worldly ear sounds like a very naive and almost quaint idea of, if we live different lives, that will have this rippling effect. And if we concentrate ourselves in church, like this is the community. Like if we set up these alternative communities that are our churches, where people are living a different way, we're living on the other side of Jesus's resurrection, while the world is still trapped in the old times, right? So we're living as this alternative community, and in the process, it's like we're bringing heaven to earth. That's what the church does, and that doesn't mean that we do it perfectly, but ideally we do it in a way that is attractive and appealing, to where for people who have eyes to see and ears to hear, they notice that there's something different, and that this is a lifestyle that we can commit to and be a part of, that we want to. That doesn't mean that it's easy. It doesn't mean that we don't mess up. All of that stuff happens, and of course it will, this side of the consummation of creation and Jesus's return. But in some ways, it's like in this already but not yet space that we find ourselves living in, like the church is the place where that makes sense. And that's why I think it's such an important thing for believers. Like you can't do that really on your own.
You can't do that on your own. That's right. We're to be a bright spot in this dark world, living out that alternative society, that alternative ethic way of life, all of that. Beautiful. What a great place to almost end, because I want to talk about, links and all that fun stuff, places people can find you. Then we got a final question, but you got a blog, you got a couple books, like point people to those. Yeah.
So I have a website, which is just my name, lukedockery.com, which is primarily a blog, but also kind of just a landing page for different things that I'm involved in. I have written a few books. We talked about youth and family ministry. That's kind of like the one that most people know about, but I've also written kind of some different Bible study stuff, some for teens, one for adults. I actually have a new book coming out, probably be late March, maybe early April, on Stone Campbell restoration movement in Churches of Christ, and teaching that to teenagers, which I could find nothing like that. And so ultimately, me and a good friend who's a professor of history at York University, like we kind of tag team that, and so that'll be coming up soon. So you can find all that stuff on my website. And I blog. I call myself an occasional blogger, because that covers, like, if you blog like 4 times a year, it's still occasional, right? So occasionally I blog, but yeah, that's where I have all my stuff, basically.
Yeah, sweet. Thank you so much for that. For sure, we want to encourage people to go check that out, that kind of stuff, because you have some good thoughts, and appreciate your blog post from today, one of those occasional posts. So not to date the podcast, but go check it out, and whatever the recent one is, it's probably good. So absolutely, and this probably should come out right near that Stone Campbell book time.
That'd be cool. Yeah.
So that would be very interesting. I just finished reading a massive general church history, and Thomas Campbell, Alexander Campbell got mentioned only associated with the disciples of Christ. And I was like, wow, that's really sad. But anyway, missed some other parts. But yeah, good job. Good shit. Good stuff.
At least we almost got a shout out, right?
Almost. So close. Got a couple names in there, but forgot about the other half of that. Well, let's get to that last question that we always leave people with. As we close, leave the audience with just one practical action they can do this week to live out their faith fully for Jesus.
Yeah, I love that question. And I'm actually going to steal something that I used in a sermon from last month. I preached a sermon based on Psalm 78 called Tell the Next Generation. And we just went through that psalm, which is very much about intergenerational, and we see both the faith family and the physical family in that psalm. And my practical action is this week: find someone of another generation that you can have spiritual conversations with. And using Psalm 78 as a template, like what sorts of things do we talk about? We can talk about the great things that God has done in our lives. We can talk about the consequences of sin, those times when we have rejected God and how that didn't turn out well for us. And then also we can talk about the character of God. Who is this God that we serve and that we love? And all of that's in Psalm 78. It talks about all of those things. And so what I encouraged our members that day was, this week, go out and have a conversation with someone of another generation about your faith. And if you're not sure what to talk about one or more of those things. And then after you do that, do it again. And then do it again. And make a lifestyle of this sort of thing. Because this is what it means for us to be an intergenerational church. This is what youth and family ministry is all about. But even more than that, this is what the family of God is all about. We're all in this together. We know each other. And so we should be having these conversations across generational lines. And by the way, this is also how we learn and grow as disciples, by having these sorts of conversations, and that just being a natural part of who we are and what we do.
Well, thank you for that. When we read through a book like Judges, we see the consequences of one generation not carrying on the message. It's ugly. It's really bad. So we gotta tell the next generation for sure.
Amen. That's right.
Well, I like to leave the Smashing Idols audience with a sharing challenge, somebody to share this episode with. So I'm going to say today, share this episode with somebody from a different generation than you.
Like that.
You might have to look up the exact stats on that. I've recently finally come to believe that I'm technically Gen Z. I tried to be a millennial for a long time, but the prevailing sociological models say I'm actually Gen Z. So I'm still recovering from that. But yeah, go share this with somebody else from a different generation, and rate and review and all that fun stuff too. Luke Dockery, thank you so much for being on and talking about the intergenerational church and youth ministry and all that fun stuff.
Thanks, Jake. I had a blast. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it, man.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for listening today to Smashing Idols. To learn more about the show and me, Jake Doberenz, head over to jakedoberenz.com and be sure to check us out on Substack. That's jakedoberenz.substack.com. There you can subscribe to this podcast, which comes out every Tuesday morning, and you can subscribe to the newsletter, also called Smashing Idols, which comes out on Friday morning, where I dive into these subjects in a short essay. You can follow me on Twitter and Threads and Instagram and all the places at Jake Doberenz. I'd love to continue the conversation there. All right, everybody, grab those hammers, get to smashing those idols.